So here we are at the end of the chapter looking at the end of the Civil War, which we actually looked at in section 4, the actual end of the fighting. What we're going to look at in this section, the legacy of the war, is look at kind of the aftermath, talk a little bit about some of the issues that the Civil War did seem to address, and also some of the new issues that the Civil War brings up, what some of those unanswered questions are, and that will lead us into chapter 12, which is on the era following the Civil War called Reconstruction. So we're going to take a look today at what some of those things that still need to be addressed or new problems that the Civil War kinds of brings up, but furthermore, how this overall changed the United States. Because the Civil War did change the United States immensely, obviously in regard to slavery, but this was definitely a crossroads kind of a moment, because while slavery was certainly at the absolute crux of this matter, that was, front and center, that was foremost, the issue that was being decided here, there really were a lot of forces at work here. There were a lot of questions. There were a lot of differences that led to this conflict. And the Civil War does seem to sort of make one of those sides win, not just the North, but sort of this whole question about exactly what kind of a country was the United States, exactly what was the role of the federal government, exactly what was the economic future of the United States. Those are all things that the Civil War does seem to address, or at least seems to push the United States into a particular direction. So let's talk a little bit about what those are. So once again, the Civil War brought about numerous, obviously, economic changes, as we'll continually bring up the abolition of slavery, which means slavery, of course, is done away with and made illegal as a result. Social changes, part of that having to do with the abolition of slavery, part of that having to do with the changes in the South, with the dismantling of that whole, old plantation economy to an extent, and big political changes, as we're going to see a shift in political power, but also a change in the overall scope and size of the federal government, which is the next point. Overall, the Civil War dramatically increased the power and the role of the federal government. And remember that the Civil War itself was partially a question about that. Part of what was being fought over here was big government versus small government, powerful federal government versus more powerful state governments. And the Confederates would have been arguing that they were fighting for stronger state governments, a true republic, a weaker federal government, and all of that. The more powerful federal government definitely won out here, and we saw during the war attempts to make the federal government stronger. There were, things like income taxes. We saw, the beginning of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, higher tariffs, more government assistance to industry, or at least the government taking a stand and kind of stepping in and making a, economic situation that benefited business and encouraged economic growth and economic development. That was part of what was at war here as well. And the federal government, although, its size and its scope goes back and forth, here and there, it never goes back to its pre-Civil War size and its pre-Civil War function. So the role of the federal government is forever increased as a result of the Civil War, and it is going to be more active, more involved, certainly more involved in the economy as a result of the Civil War. Obviously, the Civil War answers and puts to rest several questions, several of the big ones that led to this conflict. We'll get to slavery in a moment, but as well as slavery, there were questions here just overall about secession and about nullification. We've seen mostly Southerners, usually Southerners, argue for many, many years now that states had power over the federal government, that they somehow could supersede the federal government, and that they had the power to nullify or to ignore, to choose which federal laws they wanted to follow, and also that they had a right to secession, that the Union was sort of like a loose confederation, as they argued, and that you could leave, that the entrance into the Union was not a one-way door, that this was an agreement that states had voluntarily entered into and that they could voluntarily leave. The Civil War seems to answer that question in that no, they do not, and that states don't have a right to nullification, that states don't have a right to secession, at least not in a legal sense. Now, that doesn't mean that those questions don't come back up. It doesn't mean that there aren't still arguments between the federal government and the state governments. There are all the time. If you just look in the news, you will find it, but you don't really see states, at least, not, there may be some extreme people, but you don't really see states bringing up that argument as nullification as formally as they did prior to the Civil War. You don't see them calling together conventions and actually voting for nullification. There are plenty of instances in which states might just say, we're not going to do this, but it's a little bit less combative than it was here. And we certainly you might see a handful of individuals talking about it, but we have not seen actual states talk about secession in this sense. Again, at least in a legal sense, on paper, the Civil War does seem to decide, and the Civil War later even looked at the case and later ruled on it many years after this, that states in a legal sense do not have a right to secession. So it's not that people don't ever talk about it, but certainly not as formally, as combatively, and as seriously as people talked about it prior to the Civil War in 1861 and 1865. Now, of course, the big issue here is slavery, which apparently I'll get to in a second. Looking back at more changes that are brought, we mentioned the change in the scope, in the size of the federal government, and particularly the federal government's role in the economy. The northern economy, as we've already mentioned multiple times, prospered as a result of the Civil War. There were plenty of people that, suffered financial hardships and plenty of people that were ruined by it, but there were more people that did really, really well off of the war. Northern industry grew, and the government became more involved in the economy in the way of, passing tariffs to protect industries. Creating a situation, creating an environment, and this goes back to, Hamilton even, that where businesses would stand to do well, where businesses could prosper, something that was going to benefit businesses and encourage economic development. And again, the United States never goes back from that. It changes, it shifts, there's ebbs and flows in it, but it never goes back to the total hands-off, don't do anything, let the economy do what it wants to do, sort of a situation that you had prior to the Civil War. Other ways that the economy has changed, obviously the South undergoes a lot of changes as well. Now, again, we've already talked at length about how the South's economy is arguably their greatest weakness, that defeats them probably before the Union Army does, but it is almost totally destroyed. There are parts of the South, cities in the South, that are totally damaged. This image right here that looks like, this building, this factory, or whatever this was, looks like it's been totally bombed out. That's Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the Confederacy, just a few days after the war had ended. But the South's economy not only has been destroyed by the likes of Sherman and several others, and crops destroyed and all of that, and railroads destroyed, but also now that slavery is going to be abolished, there's going to be no more slavery, the South's economy is going to have to change, at least to an extent. And there were plenty of people that wanted to see the South's economy changed tremendously, that wanted to see the South become more like the North and wanted to industrialize it and all of that. We'll talk more about that in chapter 12. We will see some of that happen, but not as much as some people would have liked. But particularly, something's going to have to change in that the South no longer will have slavery. And the war is also extremely costly. Obviously, there are a huge financial cost on both sides, but also a huge cost of human life and human suffering. The Civil War is an incredibly deadly conflict. About 600,000 Americans die in the Civil War. That amounts to about 2% of the population at the time. And if you equated that to more modern numbers, that would be something more like, I'm wanting to say like 2 or 3 million. I could be wrong about that, but I know it's in the millions. But imagine some kind of calamity, a war, a natural disaster, a pandemic, claiming the lives of, more than 1 million Americans. There wouldn't be a single one of us that didn't know somebody. There wouldn't be a single one of us that wasn't directly affected, if not someone in our household, someone, a neighbor, a friend, someone that was close to us. So there are a lot of people not coming back. There are a lot of people coming back that are forever scarred, that are lost limbs, that have suffered psychological effects. So there's a huge human cost to this, as well as the fact that factories have been destroyed, roads have been destroyed, railroads have been destroyed, crops have been destroyed, people's lives have overall been disrupted. So there's a lot of psychological damage that goes along with it. As I was saying, more than 600,000 of people in the war died in the war, and lots more are coming home wounded, psychologically scarred. Farms have been destroyed, homes have been destroyed. A lot of things. It's going to take a while for all that to go back to quote unquote normal. And for a lot of people, it won't ever. So there are a lot of things that need to be reconstructed, that need to be fixed, that need to be rebuilt once we get to that Reconstruction era that we'll be looking at in chapter 12. Now, let's talk about that slavery issue. So, we know that slavery was, of course, one of the biggest things that led to this conflict, and that slavery, while when the war started, Lincoln was saying it had nothing to do with slavery, and he tried to keep that out of it, probably to satisfy the border states. But eventually, we saw how slavery worked its way into the conflict, first with the Emancipation Proclamation, and then, it being addressed in the Gettysburg Address. And right before the war ends, just a few months before the war ends, Lincoln makes the move and asks Congress to make the move to officially seal the deal on the slavery issue. And before the war ends, President Lincoln pushes through Congress, and then by the time the war is over, it's out to the states for ratification, what will become the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, the Reconstruction era, the time after the Civil War, there are 3 constitutional amendments that are going to be added, 3 additions. We call these the Reconstruction Amendments. They're very, very important. We will look at most of them in Chapter 12, but the first of those Reconstruction Amendments we're looking at right now because it actually happens, it's part of Reconstruction, but it's actually passed before the war is over, and that is the 13th Amendment. Very, very important. And the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. That means that it gets rid of slavery. This is what officially forever and always makes slavery absolutely illegal to practice in the United States. It's actually the only time that the Constitution uses the word slavery is the part where it is actually getting rid of it. Now, you may be asking, why on earth was an amendment necessary? A lot of people at the time were asking that too, given the Emancipation Proclamation that was issued 2 years before this. Remember that the Emancipation Proclamation was not all-inclusive. It did not address slavery everywhere. It did not address slavery in the border states, for example. But the bigger thing is, the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln would argue that that really didn't have anything to do with actually freeing anybody. That was part of the war. It was part of the war effort. It was about strategy. And he also knows that it's very likely that the Emancipation Proclamation could easily be overturned, that the courts could overturn it and say that President Lincoln never had the authority to do that, that he does not have the authority to essentially take people's property away from him as the president. And so this is the way to actually get that done in a legal way that will be permanent, that could not easily be overturned by the courts, that could not be easily overturned by Congress, and that wouldn't be able to be reversed by southern states once the war was over. He also wants to make sure that this gets done before the war is over, because he doesn't want the slavery thing to be a condition of the South surrendering. So he has to play this really, really carefully. He wants to make sure that the slavery issue is at rest, it's done, it's over. So when the South surrenders, they can't say, oh, and what about slavery? Can't we keep it? So that is done there. And also the Emancipation Proclamation, a lot of legal technicalities with it. Lawyers like Lincoln, for example, would argue that this might free slaves now, but it does not abolish the institution itself. But that's what the 13th Amendment does, and we'll look at those other Reconstruction Amendments a little bit later. Now, as far as that Reconstruction process goes, that's going to be very, very complicated and that's what Lincoln's really working on those final couple of months of the war before the South surrenders, but it's kind of obvious that they will surrender, just a matter of time. There were lots of different opinions about what Reconstruction ought to look like, on exactly how the South ought to be treated, what their role in it should be. Lincoln was working on that at the end of the war, and Lincoln had hinted, more than hinted, that he wanted the Reconstruction process to be kind of lenient on the South, meaning not incredibly harsh. Not because Lincoln didn't think the South did anything wrong. Lincoln just kind of felt like, you know what, we've already been fighting for 4 years. If we go into the South once this is all over and start making these huge demands and saying they got to do this and they got to do that and acting like we just, defeated them and try to punish them, then we're not going to get anywhere. We do want to change the South, and we do want it to look different, but we have to take the South with us on that. They have to cooperate with us. So he kind of hinted this leniency. Ending slavery was definitely a no-brainer to him, but further than that, Lincoln hinted that he wanted it to be not quite so harsh in order to gain Southerners' support. But as most of you know, Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction will not ever really come to fruition, because to further complicate things and to stifle the jubilation of the end of the war with incredible sorrow, as many of you know, Lincoln is assassinated just a few days after the Civil War ends. Lee surrendered to Grant, ending the fighting on April the 9th, and not even a week later on April 14th, and then he died the following day on the 15th. Abraham Lincoln and his wife went to Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. to see a play, to relax, to kind of try to enjoy themselves for once in the path of the, and that they have not done in the past 4 years. And there at Ford's Theater, Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was a Confederate sympathizer. He was an actor. And a lot of people don't know that Lincoln's assassination was actually part of a larger conspiracy, a larger plot. Booth was actually one of a couple of conspirators. They had plotted to kill not only Lincoln, but also the Vice President, the Secretary of War, and the Secretary of State. The Secretary of War was attacked, but whoever was supposed to kill the Vice President and the Secretary of State must have chickened out. So Lincoln is the only one that ends up dead as a result of this. But John Wilkes Booth sneaks into the box at Ford's Theater. He shoots the president in the back of the head. He jumps from that box, that balcony, onto the stage. People watching the play thought it was part of the play and runs off. He's caught and eventually is killed in the process a few days later. But Lincoln was taken across the street to a home where he died the following day. And so that's going to further complicate the Reconstruction process, in that you had Lincoln, who had led the country through the war, but now wasn't going to be there to kind of lead them out of it. And also his successor, Andrew Johnson, whom we'll talk a lot about in chapter 12, who's going to be the president now, his view of Reconstruction was a good bit different from Lincoln's. And to further complicate it, or to perhaps foreshadow what his plan might be like, Johnson's a Southerner. He's from Tennessee, and a former slaveholder. So he is going to view the South a little bit differently. He's going to want to treat the South a little bit differently. And furthermore, he just doesn't have the kind of political leadership genius that Lincoln did. Few people did. So that's going to further complicate things and make it a little bit more difficult. So there's still lots of questions to be answered about how is the South going to be treated? How do you readmit the South? You know, if they left the Union, how do they get back in? What are we going to do about, we know slavery's gone, but what about the status of these newly freed people? Are they citizens? Do they have rights? There were a lot of different opinions about that. Should the South be treated harshly? Should they be treated with more leniency, like Lincoln had suggested? Are we going to industrialize the South? Are we going to do all these big crazy things to modernize their economy, or are we going to kind of let them figure it out? You know, what is that going to be like? And whose job is this? Is it the president's job to handle it? Lincoln seemed to think that it was, but as you can imagine, Congress isn't going to like that too much. They're going to say, we ought to have a say-so in this. You know, the president can't just go around doing whatever they want to do. So there's all kinds of big questions, and kind of a whole new sort of a battle that has to be fought throughout Reconstruction, which is what we'll be looking at next time.